Good afternoon, and welcome to this event. This is being co-organized by UNDP Norway, the University of Oslo Center for Development and the Environment, and very kindly being hosted at this wonderful location here at NUPI, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Dan Bannick, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Oslo, not too far away from here. And I also direct the Oslo SDG initiative, and I have the enormous pleasure of moderating this discussion today. So before I outline some of the key issues, I thought, you're here mainly to hear our wonderful panelists. So we are very delighted on this lovely sunny day to welcome the Assistant Secretary General of the UN and the head of the UNDP Regional Bureau for Africa, Ahuna Ziakonwa. Welcome. You will be giving us a lovely keynote speech. We are raising expectations here now. And this will be followed by a panel with three invited speakers. We have Hamdi Mohammed, who is a former student of ours, who having studied development studies, and you work for Statistics Norway, but you're currently here representing Rethinking Economics. And then we have Ragnhild Nuros, who is a senior researcher at this very eminent research institution called PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, and she's also an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. So welcome. And where is my friend Morten Boers, who is a research professor here at NUPI, but most importantly, my former colleague at the University of Oslo. So welcome to all of you. So before we go further, this is about, we're going to discuss the demand, the need for a new narrative on a continent with more than 50 countries, very diverse, 1.3 billion people. And I thought I could just reflect briefly on a trip I recently undertook. I just got back from Ethiopia and Malawi. It was just so nice to travel after 2 years. We have all of these research projects. Fieldwork was delayed. And among the questions that I was interacting with, discussing with students, colleagues, politicians, administrators, civil society organizations, think tanks was, how do African citizens view their future? What is it that they are pleased with? What is it that they are frustrated with? And one of the first things that was highlighted was, not everything is bad. Let's not assume that everything bad somehow can be traced back to Africa. Economic growth is being rapid. Ethiopia is a case in point. I mean, you've been UNDP resident coordinator there. Tanzania. There's so many countries with fast economic growth. It's another matter that pace has not resulted in distribution, but still millions of jobs are being created. There's this huge spread of digital technology. You have, WhatsApp is just such a boon for us researchers, being able to communicate, get appointments with everyone. Some of the social media is also enabling citizens to hold their authorities to account. You have major improvements in infrastructure, thanks to the Chinese largely. You have also IT infrastructure, thanks to the Indians. But then you also have many other projects that are going on. So there's a lot. There's a hunger for education. Whenever I'm in Malawi and I was there for the first time in 2 years again, there's always a new university. There's this demand for education. We can't keep track. We can't keep up with the momentum. But not everything is, of course, working either. And here, of course, there's been quite a lot of discussion on what really must take to actually fast-track development. So there are all of these mantras out there, right? I mean, you think about Paul Collier and his bottom billion talking about 4 development traps. There's the conflict trap, the natural resource trap, the landlocked with bad neighbors trap, and bad governance trap. And some of these traps are still very relevant in terms of explaining what is working or not working on the continent. And there are others who would say it's actually about how countries aren't able to get to the sweet spot between a strong state and a strong civil society that is running at the same time. This is the James Robinson, Darren Acemoglu argument about the narrow corridor, and apparently only South Africa, in their scheme of things, is in that sweet spot. So there's a lot of these sort of explanations. And there are 3 sort of key things that I noticed on this trip, and I hope that we can talk about this today. One has to do with the concerns over food insecurity, which is, of course, something that has been exacerbated because of the war. But of course, we should also be honest, not everything can be blamed on the war or the pandemic. Things were getting bad since 2014, food prices were increasing. A lot of people are really, really angry about this. Then there's the health insecurity aspect, which is, of course, again, something that we realize a lot of people haven't really been investing in primary health care. And the pandemic has just exposed some of these cracks in many countries, but it's also exposed the selfishness of the West. And so as one of my friends told me, we knew that you guys were selfish, but we were still sort of harboring some hopes that you had good intentions. But this vaccine inequality has just shown how selfish the West is. Next time there's an emergency, we can't count on you. And then the final aspect has to do with the energy insecurity aspect. This is where there's been rising dissatisfaction. So you have President Museveni in Uganda, President Kagame in Rwanda, President Chakwera in Malawi, and not least the Vice President of Nigeria a couple of days ago in The Economist, really saying that the climate policies that the West is pursuing is colonialism in green. That this urgency to transition to renewable energy and your sort of reluctance to finance any natural gas or fossil fuel projects is really a big problem for us. You're forcing poverty on us. Solar and wind will not do it. And so there is a lot of that kind of disagreement. And I think that these are things that I hope that we can touch upon in our discussion today. And going forward, I think it's going to be pretty crucial how the trade aspect, and I think maybe Hamdi, you can talk about it, is going to be handled. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, how that is implemented is going to have huge sort of implications for the economic transformation of Africa, but also the kind of relationship that African countries would have with the West, but also with the so-called South-South cooperation partners, India and China and many others, the kind of deals that African countries can get. There's a lot of research now on how to make African countries better able to negotiate better deals. Because we often have Africa plus one summit diplomacy. There's always EU, Africa, UK, Africa, China, Africa. This is not cutting it. And how certain smaller countries, smaller economies can benefit from these summits, how Africa can be united is going to be crucial going forward. But most importantly also, in terms of multilateralism, and this is where the UN comes in, right? So I've had conversations with Achim Steiner, the head of UNDP, and we've talked about the crisis of multilateralism. Of course, Achim and others would say multilateralism is always in crisis, right? So what's new? But from an African point of view, and this is my final point, there was this feeling I got from my colleagues down there is that there's a need to actually strengthen African voices in the multilateral sort of arena. How can we do that better? That's going to be pretty crucial going forward. So Africa, in many ways, just to end where I started, should not be seen as a passive patient, but rather as an active agent. So with those words, I'd like to give the floor to the Assistant Secretary General of the UN. It's just great that you're here. So you have the floor for around 15 minutes, if you wish, but shorter if you wish to, and then we'll have a conversation. Thank you very much. So welcome. The floor is yours. Oh, you have
yes. I think you can hear me, right? Yes, okay, great. Thank you so much for that to our moderator who has actually made my speech for me. I usually like to just talk, but my people are insisting that I read my speech because they know me to tell a lot of stories. And I could be here, keep you here forever. So I'm going to read the speech that I have, and then I hope I can be more myself when we have a conversation. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for receiving me. Great to have Hamdi and Morton as well, who will be joining me on this panel. I think that, we, as UNDP, really appreciate this kind of opportunity to discuss matters that are quite deep, I would say, but require our attention. And a year ago, discussions on the future of development, which is really a coinage that the administrator is very fond of and has been championing now for some time. But that discussion was really dominated by the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and the ripples that had come out of that. And we are not yet out of the woods, right? When we talk about COVID-19, we may have unmasked ourselves and are not now able to have in-person meetings as we're having here. But the situation of access to vaccines, just sort of getting shots to arms, not just the availability of vaccine itself, especially for the poor, remains a preoccupation for development actors. And we do know that more variants could still emerge until we have a shot for all. Today, the future of development is being discussed amidst what we see evolving in Ukraine. The impact of the war on the international system, global economies, and Africa is, of course, rapidly unfolding. We haven't seen the last of it. It is evolving in front of us. And I commence my intervention today with how development should be understood in this landscape that we're seeing, first COVID-19 and now a war that has a global reverberation. So for the first point is that development has to cease being in people's minds as aid, as charity, something that you're just handing out to people because, you're such nice people. It is really about cooperation. It is about the sort of understanding that we are a global village, more and more. And what happens in Ukraine affects lives in the Gambia and vice versa. It is about cooperation between nations. It is about the choices that we make to collectively address societal challenges like the impact of climate change, like insecurity that is triggered by, say, violent extremism or terrorism, like poverty, inequality, unemployment, and other challenges that we see today. Yet, our collective determination to save a successive generation from the scourge of war, which has brought untold sorrow to mankind, is under threat. I don't think any time in our recent history have we been faced with a harder challenge than navigating that space for peace and security in a healthy planet than now. Our collective determination to guarantee equal rights of nations and peoples, both large and small, has been seriously questioned. And our collective determination to maintain and promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom remain but an aspiration. The global society, as we know it, for over the last 75 years, is indeed at a crossroads. The question that has been repeatedly asked as I engage with various European stakeholders in Brussels, where I just came, and in Geneva, and now in Oslo, is what does this mean for the future of development in a region such as Africa that is still at the very beginning of its development journey? It means that Africa bounces back from the brink in our own perspective, that this we saw demonstrated during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, which really affected global supply chains and put Africa at the back seat in relation to access to pharmaceutical products, including vaccines. But Africans innovated. Africa woke up. Africa was resilient. Africa adapted very quickly through local production. We heard some predictions that dead bodies will be lying on the streets of Africa in the height of this pandemic. That didn't really happen. And this wasn't just because Africans were immune to COVID-19. There were deliberate efforts invested in making sure that this did not become Africa's pandemic. And this is why it was that strength, that resolve that was demonstrated even in the midst of pre-existing conditions that several countries were going through, that gives me as a development actor hope. It gives me optimism, a stubborn hope and a stubborn optimism, and a renewed positive outlook about the future of development in Africa, notwithstanding an immediate impact of the war in Ukraine on Africa is food security. Notwithstanding all of this, we have that immediate impact. Russia and Ukraine account for 30% of global wheat production and 80% of sunflower oil. In 2020, African countries imported $4 billion worth of agricultural products from Russia, 90% of which was wheat. And if you know, in many places in Africa, bread is a source of life. People could go to war for the absence of bread. African countries such as Benin, Egypt, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cabo Verde, and others are particularly vulnerable due to their heavy reliance on imports from Russia and Ukraine. The risk of exacerbated insecurity in fragile regions in Africa also remains. This is the second impact. So the Lake Chad Basin, for instance, that region is still ravaged by the threat of violent extremist groups and the effect of climate change. The lake is drying up. That lake is the source of life for many communities. And for years, they depended on it. And one day, they didn't have the water that they used to have to navigate for fish production and other things that they live by. That is spilling into insecurity. The intractable conflict in the Sahel has been deepened by the resurgence of military coups in countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea. The drought crisis in the Horn of Africa continues to create new displacements. We know that drought happens in many parts of the world, but we also know that we don't necessarily see people dying or animals, becoming carcasses as a result of drought. So there is something wrong there. Even in relatively stable regions like Southern Africa, social tensions and the violent extremism in the Cabo Delgado region of Mozambique are also emerging. Thirdly, Africa and Europe are geographically and culturally tied. Someone in Geneva described it to me as, Africa is a sister continent to Europe. As such, the future of Africa's development is the future of Europe's prosperity. This is a very young continent, Africa. Europe is an aging continent. And so, if you think the future, you're going to know that these two continents will need each other. Partnering with a diverse but rapidly changing continent with an abundance of innovation and entrepreneurship will always be mutually beneficial for Africa and Europe. And that includes a country like Norway. So irrespective of the international state of mind right now, the fundamentals for Africa and Europe to remain strategic partners for sustainable development remain unchanged. And this is really the core of my message in undertaking this trip. First, small investments can make a big difference. When I took up this position in the summer of 2018 in New York as Africa Director, I was struck by the investments made in security interventions across conflict-affected countries in Africa, especially in Lake Chad and in the Horn. The burden I was confronted with was how to complement security investment with stabilization priorities. In other words, development-type activities that can be brought in place as soon as areas are liberated through security interventions. This is why UNDP decided to establish the Regional Stabilization Facility in the Lake Chad Basin region affected by these Boko Haram and other extremist group activities to promote community security, to restore livelihood opportunities, and to provide basic infrastructure. Last November, I visited the area in the company of the ambassador of Norway to Nigeria, and we were impressed by the results that we saw achieved. It was like witnessing restorative development, because you're talking about people whose lives overnight had become completely decimated, who hope had been snatched from them, and suddenly there was an opportunity to rebuild, and there was hope in their faces that we looked at. Second, crises can be real opportunities for sustainability. Africa is responsible for only 4%, even under 4% of global carbon emissions. Africa holds the promise of creating strong partnerships for green transformation. But it has to be just. And as we just heard, it's not enough to just say to Africa, just put solar systems and that's going to, solve all your problems. Africa and the international system must cooperate in building resilience to oil shocks by reducing their dependence on fossil fuels and by accelerating their capacity to generate renewable energy and promote a green and blue economy. Investments in these areas will be a catalyst for sustainable development. And Africa is ready to lead in this regard. Third is the rise of pan-womanity, something we describe as pan-womanity, which prioritizes the leadership role of women in transforming Africa. This is something UNDP believes in quite strongly, promoting leadership and financial inclusion of women, girls, and young talents can transform the global development landscape. It is something we should not underestimate in terms of its power. It's been the missing factor in our development trajectory. Many women are left behind, and so are youth. And youth increasingly demonstrating that they have that ingenuity, they have that talent, and they can be drivers of development. So we stop treating them like a problem and start seeing them as part of the solution. It is with this mindset that I recently launched a program that we call Timbuktu. And some of you may have heard the word but never been there. Anybody here been to Timbuktu? You probably grew up hearing, on the road to Timbuktu, which for some people meant on the road to nowhere, that a fictitious place, but it's actually a place that exists, and it is the birthplace of knowledge and of commerce. And the richest man that ever lived in the historic terms comes from Timbuktu. His name was Mansa Musa. So a place of great, cultural DNA that we can tap into to establish a Pan-African startup for supporting entrepreneurs to generate industry and sustain income. So ladies and gentlemen, I can talk forever about Timbuktu, but I will not. Let me conclude. These examples are merely illustrative rather than exhaustive ways of how Africa's development requires a new way of thinking. Africa's promise is enormous, and we have to enter the continent through this lens of promise and opportunity. Trust me, those of you who go to the continent, you go to any part of it right now, including places where there is conflict, you feel a different vibe. There is vibrancy, there is expectation, enthusiasm, but there is commitment to solutions, homegrown solutions. So there is something to invest in. Africa's young population is innovating. We've just published our second edition of Africa Innovates. It focuses on the climate champions, young people who are coming up with innovations that solve development challenges, but in solving them, protect the environment. Africa's development will rest on enabling, not aiding innovation, talent, and the local ecosystem of opportunities. The era of Africa's dependence on perpetual charity has waned, and the future of Africa's development is bright, and it's today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I request you to please sit here?
Yeah.
And can I request the panel to please join me up here? Hamdi may be there, Ragnhild, Morten. Thank you very much. I mean, I'm not going to do that summing up bit, but the idea, the definition of development, some of the challenges, the demography, the demographic dividend in many ways, that's something that I think we're going to talk about. Trade, climate, vulnerability to conflict, lots of issues here. I'm told the organizers have decided on a format where each of our panelists gets around max 5 minutes. If shorter, that's even better, so that we can have a discussion. So I want to start with you, Hamdi. Could you reflect a bit on Ahuna's presentation, but also on behalf of rethinking economics, how should we be rethinking this development paradigm? What is it that you would highlight?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So one of the many good points that you have raised is the issue of food security. And in many reports, amongst them the World Bank, we find that for many low-income countries, the highest share when it comes to the total household expenditure, it goes to food. And consequently, a sizable share of the national economy for many African countries is food expenditure. And so for African countries that import the essential items such as oil, gas, wheat, and corn, they become very vulnerable to external supply shocks, as we have now seen with the war in Ukraine, where the rising gas prices and the wheat prices has an immediate effect on those with the lowest income, who already spent a huge share of their income on food, and now they have to spend more. And so what happens is that these countries end up importing war-induced inflated prices on food and gas, which further exacerbates the inequality that already exists in this country. And a result of this is that Africa, as you have said, has to look towards not just aid, but towards becoming more self-sufficient and in a sustained manner, and that they secure themselves against such external supply shocks, so that they are not very vulnerable when things like the war in Ukraine happens. And so what is needed then is a change in narrative. And research has shown that African scholars are almost absent from debates that end up shaping the discussions on development scholarship and policies about the continent. And I would say, as a rethinking economist, that one of the ways to change the narrative is to decolonize the development discourse. And what I mean by that is that we have to give the platform to African scholars and researchers who have conducted research within an African context, that they be treated as equal partners in the discussions about the development discourse. I read this article written by a scholar called Grieve Chelwa, where he said, does economics have an African problem? And his findings is not just only within economics per se, but also in other fields as well, where he sees that in editorial boards, you don't find Africans there. When it comes to research conducted within an African context, they are not presented in the editorial boards as well. The research topics which are chosen are mostly demanded by institutes in the global north, who oftentimes have a given understanding of Africa and what African problems are. And so a solution to this would be to give African scholarship the same platform to kind of like form and engage with the development discourse, which has an ultimate effect on how the policies are created on the ground. And so when that is not done, you have this warped development agenda that is very different from the lived experience on those on the ground. And so to create, the creation of knowledge and which we need to create good policies entails or necessitates that the lived experience of those on the ground be taken into account, so as to create good policies that gives us the result that we want.
So, and we'll return to this later on, but am I sort of understanding it correctly that, are you saying that a lot of the academics, they feel that this global agenda, let's say the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, these are negotiated and there's a lot of participation, right, in these international forums, and all of these countries have, this is the most consultative process ever. So do they still feel left out? Is this also seen to be this sort of Western-led agenda of development?
I would say yes. In many ways, it is a very much kind of like sustained, because as I've said before, the development agenda is created and sustained in the global north, and a result of this is that the contextualized understanding on what is happening on the floor is lacking from the discussions that eventually receive or the projects that receive the funding for policies and for topics that pertain to the African continent.
Yeah, we can return to this later. So Ragnhild, I'll give you the floor. So you're interested in demography. So maybe that's something that I think Ahuna touched upon it. So your reflections, please.
That's one of the things that I picked on from the speech that I thought I wanted to talk about a little bit. This, the fact that the African continent is such a young continent. There are so many young people in Africa relative to other parts of the world. And so, of course, when we talk about a new narrative in the future, we have to talk about young people. And I'm interested in research that looks at this, the idea of the demographic dividend. From a political science perspective, and from, I think also maybe a lot of state leaders and others, think about young people as a potential problem. There's a rebelliousness of youth. These are troublemakers. There's, as soon as you say youth, you're talking about violent extremism and other things. And so then the gut reaction is, what can we do about this problem? It's not necessarily always the right course of action, or it's giving opportunities to young people and investing in entrepreneurship and all these things is maybe the way to go. But instead, what ends up often happening is that state leaders will then increase repression, increase control with young people, try to get young people to be interested in other things than challenging the existing. Okay. So instead of thinking about ways of getting a demographic dividend and the positive things that maybe economists focus on, young, vibrant population means more people that can be productive part of the economy, start businesses, make things happen. For a lot of state leaders, the immediate gut reaction might be, let's repress, let's keep tighter control. And so that is where I'm coming from in terms of the research that I'm interested in, and I think has an important, it's an important thing to focus on moving forward. So I'm interested in under what are the conditions under which this demographic, having so many young people, having this youth bulge could do that's positive. What policies do we want to shape that can actually benefit from this rather than thinking of going the repressive route, because that has been, we have strong empirical findings that when there's a young population, states have a tendency to increase repression preemptively, whereas economists think that there's a great potential here. And there's some additional nuances I want to add to that. One very important thing is gender and women. Including women is the greatest untapped potential in this youth population. We know that development can excel if women are included, and there's a huge potential there. So that's one very important factor. And then I think also when I think about demographic dividends, I want to go also beyond just in looking at growth, economic growth. I think there's a dividend, political dividend, and a social dividend as well. And I think youth are not only rebellious, maybe in the negative sense, but also challenging the existing, challenging the structures and the norms and the social cues that maybe need to be challenged. Taking on new technologies, thinking differently, all these are things that don't necessarily, they can have an economic impact, but it's also about social norms. It's about political engagement, being involved, speaking up. So I'm wondering how we can tap this demographic dividend also in the social and political spheres, not only in terms of economic growth. So that's where I want to put the emphasis.
So let me just ask you, I suppose, a very general question here. One of the things that one thinks about in terms of the African continent, like a stereotypical approach, somebody's going to fix your microphone while I ask you this, is that African leaders are usually very old. That's this kind of perception. The population is very young. Why does this demographic dividend in terms of having a young population not translate into leadership positions for relatively young people, 40-year-olds, even 50-year-olds like me, you know, in many of these countries? What would you say to that? Why does that not happen that much? Maybe you have your microphone.
I don't know.
working.
Does the microphone work now? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Why doesn't that happen? It should happen. I think there's a lot of good intentions and a lot of nice words spoken about inclusion of young people. But to a lot of people, there is an actual zero-sum game where it's, I have to give up some of my power for others to get power. So we shouldn't be naive and think that there's not politics here. There's politics, there's interests, and there are vested interests that people are preserving. So this needs to be, we cannot expect people to give up power willingly necessarily. So this needs to be worked on in a sustained manner. And there needs to be some pressures maybe to make that happen. It's the same with gender inequality and getting women participation. It doesn't come, and it hasn't come, without a fight. And I think it's the same thing here with the youth agenda. It is also interesting to see that for some African countries, when I talk, or a lot of researchers and World Bank and so on talk about the youth bulge, we're talking about 15 to 24-year-olds. In some African countries, they're talking up to 35. And I think that's a symptom of where youth ends because of these lack of opportunities to make that step into adulthood in the true, like, holistic sense of the word.
Yeah, you know, and some of the stuff that's coming out of some of the recent research is that whenever there is a demand by the youth for greater political representation, as you said, there's this kind of repression. So and this is the Red Queen effect that Acemoglu talks about. You know, civil society and the state have to be running fast at the same time.
Yes.
If one slacks off, then you either have a repressive state or an over-dominant civil society, so which can also be bad because it questions the legitimacy of the state. But again, we can return to these issues. You've been quiet for a while, and then the floor is finally yours, Morten. Over to you.
Thank you. Just very quickly on that one. I mean, it seems like to be a little provocative. I mean, where do we have young leaders now? Well, I mean, you have them in Mali, you have them in Burkina, you have them in Guinea. So do you need a military coup in order to get them on? I mean, I think we need to, no, seriously, I think we need to look very seriously at what in fact has happened in these three countries, and also how, what has happened to the population, and particularly the youthful population, who has been quite supportive of these coups, for good and for bad reasons. And why is this happening? Well, I think it relates a lot to several of the things that you were saying, Auna, in your speech. I mean, because Africa has had a solid decade of economic growth, and a lot of things started to happen in several places, not all places. I mean, parts of the Sahel is a problem in its own. But other places, a lot of things happened. I mean, you started to see people started to crawl out of informality into jobs and more formal lower end of the job sector and so on and so forth. Senegal was a good example of that, Dakar, for example. Then came first the indirect economic effects of COVID-19. And now on the top of that, we get the costs of the global sanction regime against Russia. And as always, when these things are introduced, unfortunately, I mean, those that is going to pay the highest price for the sanctions against Russia, that's poor, marginalized communities in the most fragile states in the world, due to this very reasons that you mentioned. But apart from that, so it's relatively easy to predict who the general losers will be from this, apart from, of course, those that are losing out on the battlefields in Ukraine and so on, but elsewhere. But then the question becomes also, I mean, what will happen with different African countries with regard to all of this? Because this, what is happening now, the sort of combined effects first of COVID-19 and then this global sanction regime, is that it is some sort of a global shift going on. And global shifts tend to produce winners and losers. And how will various African countries try to position themselves? What we see is that there are a certain, I shouldn't say, reluctance among several African countries to sort of right up to this coalition of the willing against Russia. There's a certain sort of reluctance, I would say, for several reasons. But one reason is, of course, that, I mean, when I talk to several of my African colleagues, I mean, particularly in the Sahel, they're not very concerned about this. I mean, I guess that somebody may be thinking that about time that you also had a war on your hands. I mean, we have been struggling with ours for such a long time. So, but there are other areas here where Africa could be winning, and one of them is the issue of mineral resources. And you mentioned this, what you said, which I think was a good way of putting it, this about sort of a certain colonial mindset and attitude when it comes to the West with regard to how we would like to see climate change policies introduced also in Africa, taking into consideration that Africa produces very little of the global CO2 emissions. On the other hand, I mean, Africa sits on some of the most valuable mineral resources if a green economy is to be introduced. I think it's worth mentioning that 2/3 of the world's cobalt reserves are to be found in DR Congo. And while for the platinum group minerals, I mean, the green shift depended upon getting these minerals from Russia. But South Africa also has a lot of them. So, I mean, to what extent will African countries also be able to grab the new opportunities that this is creating? It will create winners and losers, but it could also create winners in Africa. For example, with regard to finding new sources for these mineral resources that we know probably for a long time do not want to buy from Russia. How should we see that in relation to the enormous problem that you alluded to, and that is the wheat and sunflower dependence on Russia, but also Ukraine? I know both of them are more or less out of the world market. And here again, this is not similar across Africa. It's first and foremost the highest dependence on Russian wheat. You find it in North Africa and again the Sahel, with the gravest example being Somalia, which is almost totally dependent upon it. So how will these things play each other out? What kind of winners and losers will this create in Africa as we sort of move forward? And we, unfortunately, we are probably going to be stuck into this, both this war, but also these costs of these global sanction regimes for a long, long time. And this is something that we need to think much more innovatively about, and we need to think about it to allude to what you were saying, Hamdi, and there is we need new types of partnerships between Norway and Africa, between Europe and Africa, and not only for development. I think perhaps even more important is that we need new partnerships for knowledge production between Africa and Norway, between Africa and Europe. And in that regard, I think we all can do more than we have done so far. But by doing more, I mean that Norwegian research environment, Norwegian policymakers needs to be more. But it also there is a need that it's being done more also on the other side. Because that partnerships, that also means that to be equal partners, you need to be involved in the whole process of knowledge production. Thank you.
Sorry, I think that was me.
Sorry, I'll
Great,
stop there.
thanks, Morten. So just a quick follow-up to what you said. So we need lithium and we need cobalt. We need all of this to make our electric cars here, our iPhones here, or in China and buy them here. We don't build them here. What is it that some of these countries that are very rich in minerals, what is it that they haven't been able to achieve? I mean, so my question is, what can be done for them to get a better deal?
The only way to get a better deal is that they have to move up the production ladder. They have to stop being sort of exporting these as raw commodities. I mean, there is completely, I mean, Nigeria is a very good example of that. I mean, selling crude oil, imported refined oil, I mean, it's, sorry, it's silly. It's silly, and it should have been
I agree.
done something with a long time ago. But then for different reasons, which makes sense if you understand the Nigerian contextual logic, I understand why it has not taken, because it very much at the heart of that matter is a trust issue. A trust issue about what will, because I mean, Nigerian unions see themselves as sort of guaranteeing the only social contract that they think exists, and that is that the oil and gas prices are relatively low. But that's another matter. But DR Congo, for example, it needs melting capacity. It needs to move up that ladder. South Africa is probably of these countries the one that is best placed to try to become a winner in this new game for these kind of minerals. But other African countries could also follow suit. There are interesting conversations about this going on, for example, in and around Goma in North Kivu, about how one could build and get investment for these kind of technologies. But it's a matter of sort of trying to combine technology, governance, and the trust that this governance will actually work for the benefit also of investors, but also for the people who live there. And that is not necessarily the easiest sort of equation to put together.
No, so Ahuna, let me bring you back into the conversation, because here there is what Morten says, but also what Hamdi mentioned. I think there is this idea, or in a way, this paradox that a lot of big powers want to export their stuff or to extract resources, but there is lesser interest often in developing manufacturing capacity, be it pharmaceuticals. This is something I've been interacting with Indian policymakers. India is the pharmacy to the world, but it mainly exports to Africa. There's very little production within. Or the Chinese in terms of infrastructure. What are your thoughts there in terms of stimulating this manufacturing capacity that Paul Kagame keeps talking about and many others? What is it that really needs to be done to give this a big push in many ways?
It's the biggest question on the table
Indeed.
today. Yeah?
And it's reserved for you.
Yeah, and I think where there is a will, there's a way. You know, this is not impossible to achieve. It has become an existential issue for Africa, and we saw it during COVID. We see it now with the lockdown and disruption of global value chains. Africa cannot continue to depend on the outside world for what it needs to stay alive. You know, so when COVID hit, we realized that 70% of all that Africa needed to protect itself and the medicines had to come from outside. So the lockdown was a wake-up call that Africa needed to start looking at local production of the things, essentials that it needs for medical. And there is progress there. Now we're seeing, in Geneva, I was meeting with actually in Brussels, with the European Investment Bank, that is investing in a number of countries, 4 countries so far in Africa, for the production of vaccines. Not just COVID-19 vaccines, but also looking at other illnesses that Africans deal with that they don't really have answers for. Malaria. There is some vaccine on malaria, but it's only got a limited effective rate. So how can mRNA technology be used to get higher effectiveness of a malaria vaccine? All these questions are now being asked and looked at in places like Mauritius, South Africa, Kenya, Senegal, where these investments are happening. So again, it's about cooperation and investment rather than handing out vaccines to Africans. You know, it's how can Africa develop its own capacity? The same with food production. Africa importing most of what it eats, it's also not viable. So a made in Africa revolution is now the narrative, and that comes through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, because that was not in the picture before. Now you have it. It is driving down, 90% of tariffs removed. Africa can finally trade with itself. At the moment, is at 15%. I don't know what it is for Europe in terms of Europe trading with itself. So this is a non-starter. And part of that problem is not just the market doesn't exist, it's the productivity is not there. So if you have the incentive of the market now, and driving sort of that imperative of productivity, because you need products to trade, right? So how do we transform the economies of the context, structural economic transformation that makes that cocoa become chocolate, so you can sell it rather than just exporting the cocoa in raw form, or coffee beans, or the minerals that we're talking about. Incidentally, DRC just launched the establishment of a battery factory, where it will, for the first time, convert its lithium, to batteries that add value that will increase its return by 24 times. That could transform the economy of DRC and perhaps end this sort of cyclical humanitarian crisis that the world is dealing with today. So it's not just for DRC, it's also for the entire world. But to get there, I mean, one day the leadership of the DRC will tell you the story of the the obstacles they had to, the hurdles they had to jump just to be able to establish a lithium factory. Because there are other interests that would rather just get the raw material, process it somewhere else in the world, and make the money themselves. So Africa has a big fence to scale in terms of the world accepting that it has the right to go in this direction of transforming its own natural resources and not just being the world supplier of raw materials to develop other parts of the world. So for me, I think it's a key question. It is possible to do. It requires partnership, but more importantly, all the spoilers, those who are standing in the way of Africa going in this direction, have to be tackled. Basically, there are the spoilers. There are those who don't want Africa to get there because they continue to depend on Africa's raw materials. But it's now an existential issue for Africa and for the world. We cannot afford an Africa that is not able to go up in the productivity chain and make possible all those gains. It involves energy transitions. How do you up productivity when 600 million people on the continent have no sustainable or affordable access to energy? So the energy question comes into the picture, right?
And I'm particularly concerned about that. I think that is the question that we should be discussing, really. I want to reserve it for slightly later in the conversation, but I think some of the examples you mentioned are spot on. I'm thinking about made in Africa telephones in Rwanda. You have electric cars being assembled in Kigali. You have chocolate factories in Ghana. This is no longer South Africa. It's no longer Kenya. It's also others that are joining in, which I think is a good thing. I want to bring all of you into the conversation, and this really goes back to this idea of development, right? We have this idea that sometimes development is win-win, but it is actually a very contested notion, right? And we all have our national interests involved. And I'd like you to just briefly reflect on how you think the major powers think about Africa. Because I know the Chinese, for example, think about Africa in terms of political support. It's not necessarily always in terms of economic support or benefits. It is about getting the votes in the UN, etc. 54 countries, that's a huge thing. But what is it about Africa? Because we can talk about investments, manufacturing capacity, but in the end, it is always about how will it improve, well, how will it help me? So Morten, how does this work out in your view? Is Africa or African countries, certain countries, seem to be politically more important and thereby worthy of investments than others? That's at least something that I often think about.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Africa represents a lot to different countries, and it represents different things. I mean, whereas I think that it may be fair to say that to a certain extent, I mean, Europe, even though the idea of a partnership has evolved between Europe and Africa, I think that perhaps particularly the European populations are still stuck in somewhat sort of Africa is a place where you give that we give aid to. Type of thinking. The Chinese is, as you alluded to, slightly different. It's the political support is important, but also, I mean, China as also some sort of latecomer into the quest for global resources had to go where it was free space basically. So that also has sent China on a drive for resources in parts of Africa, of course. Then you have countries who more see Africa both as a place to get resources, for possible political support for some issues, but also increasingly, and I think this is important, although it has sort of probably gotten a little turn down after the COVID-19 and over what is happening with the global sanction regime. But Africa was also increasingly seen by many as one of the last interesting market, so to speak. And what we're seeing is that there has been a multiplicity of actors involved in Africa, external actors involved. I mean, it's no longer only 3-4 actors, it's a whole range of actors operating. And of course, countries then with relatively sensible governments will of course try to take advantage of this. And some have positioned themselves better than others in doing so, either because how they market themselves, but I mean how you market yourself in the international, or should I say, in the global market of politics also depends on what is it that you have to market. I mean, some have something to market, others not. And I think what we will see in the future also with regard to these kind of issues and the global alliances and what will become possible in some countries and why it's not becoming possible in other countries. It has to do with leadership, but it also has to conflict. I mean, you don't invest in a manufacturing facility in Mali. I mean, you would be silly to do that right now. Whereas you would do that in Rwanda. What is it Paul Kagame has? Stability. And productivity, and things are working. It's a sort of easy place to operate, and that means also some will say that okay, he may be slightly authoritarian, but we can live with that because we don't want to go next door because they may be more democratic, but nothing happening. There is constant slippery slopes of politics and these kind of things. And how this will be marketed and played out, we'll also see very sort of differences in an African agency, where some will be marketing their stability, others will be marketing how they say, the democratic credentials, while others again may be marketing their very fragility, because fragility can also be an asset if you use it correctly, at least for regime survival purposes. And that's another difference here, how this will be played out in Africa, because one thing is talking about these structural conditions that sort of is above Africa, who will allow what and so on, but it also has a lot to do with what kind of agency that African countries are able to put on the table themselves. And what we will see in the future is a country that will be even more differentiated than it is today.
So
some will be run off, others will lose.
So the issue is agency is the key question,
Yeah.
and that's what I tried to allude to in my comments, is that there's often this perception that somebody else is doing development in Africa rather than, and this is your point too, right, that it is the local people actually deciding what is to be done. I want to just bring Ragnhild into the conversation because you are also at Michigan. And I'm thinking about all of this Africa +1 diplomacy, these summits that are held. The US has often been absent in many of these discussions, right? So The Economist a couple of years ago talked about the new scramble for Africa. And there you saw all these other powers, including Russia. You know, they had the summit in Sochi, right? Which led to lots of infrastructure, energy deals, security, whatever. But the US has always been somewhat absent in terms of infrastructure, etc. What is the take from the US perspective, from Michigan? I mean, how do policymakers, you think, view Africa? Is it more of a potential as an investment hub, or is it something we don't know much about?
I think it's my impression, right? And I'm not speaking for Michigan or the US, but I think there is not much of anything. I think it's, for most people, distant land, we don't know much about it. It's not really maybe seen as a new market to tap into. It's more, it's not maybe on the radar as much as it should be, just a place where aid goes, and other than that, people might not know that much about it. So at least that's my impression, other than from some of my very eager students who have a very strong interest and who have a lot of knowledge and are looking for for information about Africa and maybe have a more nuanced perspective.
It certainly didn't help with the Trump administration, calling African countries a certain word.
Many things have not helped in that respect.
But
yes.
when I speak with my students, they were not very impressed with Barack Obama either. You know, there was this promise that didn't really materialize, so we can't always just blame Trump. There's this constant neglect by the Americans of the continent. And what is frustrating, and I'd like to hear your views, Hamdi, is that now that the West has somewhat caught up or is trying to do something in terms of infrastructure, so the EU talks about the Global Gateway project, there's Build Back Better World from the Biden administration. What is frustrating for my students, for my colleagues in many of these countries, is that all of these initiatives are launched as a way to counteract China's rise. It's not because these countries are interested in promoting development in Africa. And that itself is a non-starter. I mean, you can't do something and say, we're not doing it because we like you, it's because we don't like someone else.
It's either that, or in the case of the US, where, like in Europe, people see people drowning on the coastlines of Europe, and in the US, they see people coming across the borders, the southern borders of the US. So that's maybe more where people's attention is, where are people coming to this country from. Yeah. So that could be part of it. Now there are African migrants also coming via Latin America to get into the US, but that's a longer story.
Hamdi, your thoughts on this? How can we get better traction, a different perception in international discussions, in forums? How do we strengthen that voice, apart from academia, apart from students and professors? What else?
I think political platforms are also important. I think one of the main issues here when it comes to arenas such as the EU, African Union meetings and so on and so forth, that there is like this power dynamic that cannot be ignored, where oftentimes those who have more money also have more political capital than those who have less. And we also have seen when it comes to the corona pandemic, how many countries in the global south, when they try to remove the patent from the COVID vaccines, how the global north has made sure the pushback, they have denied them the access to the patent so that they themselves could create the vaccines. And so maybe I'm a bit pessimistic here, because I think in many ways that one ways of if we talk about giving political platform, treating African countries as equals to other partners when discussing issues that concerns Africa, then it is important that countries in the global north are aware of the power dynamic and that the citizens in those countries put their governments to account and ensure that they uphold their part of the deal. And so the governments have to be put to account, they have to fulfill their parts of the deal, and the deals must be created in such a way that it benefits all the participants who are involved.
Okay, Ragnar?
Yeah, I think I also wanted to follow up on that. I think that's a very important point, and also what Morten said. I think there's the long term versus the shorter term, or there's different priorities here. And I think that unfortunately, in many instances, the political and the economic concerns might be going against each other, because it becomes tempting to just say someone from Africa said something, so it's an African voice, and hence we should go with that. And not everyone speaks for the whole country. It matters who you talk with in each of these African countries. It's not, you can't just replace one by the other and expect it to be the same. The same goes with, or a related thing is the temptation of saying we'll just look at Rwanda and say that things are going well there, things are, in the swing of things, and people are using computers and businesses are starting, and seeing this image and then looking away from the other problems. And so it becomes tempting to choose economic growth and look away from the problematic aspects.
So I think this is a good point, because it has to do with how major actors, whether it's the private sector or governments, actually interact with stakeholders or policymakers. This is something the Chinese have learned the hard way. because the model of development for China has always been, whoever's in power, whether it is democratically or non-democratically elected, we will interact because that's how our system is back home. So we don't care in terms of who we talk with, whoever's in power. And so now they know that that could be a bit dicey, right? Because if this person, and this goes back to the stability point, if this person loses the election because the party isn't doing a good job, then a lot of your investments maybe, are at risk. So I want to just turn our attention to something that you mentioned, and I'd like to hear, Ahuna, your views too, on aid, because this is something in terms of the Norwegian discourse. There's a lot of talk about how generous we are. We have the 1% gross national income principle, and we are more concerned about the 1% than actually, because a lot of this money is actually increasing as our economy with GDP growth, a lot of money, sometimes we aren't able to disperse it. I think earlier today, I think NORAD presented their findings in terms of what is working, and I think we are the good guys in many ways. We could be better in some ways, but how should the aid discourse change, Hamdi, Ahuna? Where is it that we should be, is it the conversation, is it like the donor-recipient thing that still characterizes much of this relationship? Or should it be more of this win-win, I scratch your back, you scratch my back? I've often sort of felt that I've told our ambassadors that we should be saying to many of the countries that we provide aid to, we also want something from you. It's also important. We're not just that you give. We also think you're important. If you don't do that, people feel like this is just a one-way, gifts coming, but no reciprocity. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that you said, and I think the discussion on aid has been ongoing for as far as I can remember. You had this period where people were talking about trade, not aid, and then you have different narratives that kind of
Ambisa Moyo was talking about it.
Exactly, and she criticized the aid industry in Africa, which she did not directly say that aid was the result of the lack of economic growth in Africa, but she hinted at that, and it was for the reader to conclude, oh yeah, aid is very bad for Africa, and African countries should trust in the market mechanisms and be self-sufficient. And then she has also faced critique on her book where it was said you cannot expect the market mechanisms to work in favor of African countries, that by cutting out aid and relying on the global market, you fail to look at things like structural systems that inherently discriminate African countries against other countries in the global south. And so and on the other point where you said, if I scratch your back, I'll scratch your back, I think that is also a very problematic aspect of aid, in the sense that aid comes with conditions and not necessarily in the ways that the country or the population who need the help want it. And so there are many examples from the field, but I will use one example when I was doing my bachelor's in development studies, where there was this case where the EU were funding a university in Tanzania, where they gave them funding for a research project that the EU wanted to kind of give funding to. But the scholars at that given universities were more interested to get funding for another project that they thought would be that would help the local people there. And so what the EU said, or those who represented the agency, they said, well, we cannot give you money for that because the funding is made for that topic or agenda. Mm-hmm. And so to earn the funding, you have to research on that topic and not necessarily on the topic that you yourself deem is more important. And so you see how the power relations kind of works into what topics will be looked into, what topics would be researched, even though it doesn't reflect the needs of the people on the ground.
Ahuna, what about multilateralism? I know you're also interested in sort of reformed, perhaps, multilateralism. I referred to this idea that it's always in permanent crisis, maybe. A lot of people are dissatisfied with how the international community has or has not been able to respond to these major crises. But one of the things that I've spoken with UNDP staff, with many other UN people over the years, has to do with getting donors like Norway to generously fund multilateral institutions, including the UN. to do innovative work in many parts of the world. But I'm told that discussion is also often fraught with lots of difficulty, and it has to do with how UN, UNDP, many others have to sort of document the value for money, right? And there's always this fear the donors will cut and prioritize something else. So your general thoughts on sort of the ways in which aid that is channeled through multilateral institutions such as yours can be done in a more effective manner. Where should the emphasis be going forward now?
So first, some general perspectives on aid to build on what Hamdi was saying. I think the notion that aid is free is wrong. Because, every country that gives aid to any country has an interest. So there is no, free lunch anymore. There is always some interest, and it is a lot about scratch my back, I scratch yours. Secondly is, I think the aid, if you look at ODA, it's really shrinking in relation to need. But the aid framework itself is so dominant in the conversation, in the discourse.
Indeed.
You wouldn't know that you take a country like Uganda. When I was there now 4 or 5 years ago, the ODA portion of ODA to the country's budget was less than 18%. But the aid talk dominated the relationship. It was like this was the only thing that you would have thought it was 80%. So first of all, we need to put aid in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
It is, if you look at what countries have to pay trillions of dollars to achieve the SDGs, ODA is nowhere near. So the second point relating to that is seeing how minute it is in the sort of larger picture. It has to be more surgical in it's still important, especially for smaller countries.
Mm-hmm.
It means little for South Africa or Nigeria, but maybe for smaller countries like Rwanda is still a very important component. But the quality of aid has to be looked at. What is the money going into? Sometimes there's earmarking that makes no sense in terms of what the country needs to actually develop. So the quality of the little ODA that's there has to be investigated in its ability to catalyze greater development outcomes. Yeah, and I think the last point on that is I forget what your question was.
About UNDP, multilateralism,
yes, multilateral,
reformed. Yeah.
Right. I think that, I work in UNDP, and I've worked in other agencies, in the UN and other entities. I can see the difference with the character, the DNA of UNDP as a development entity is to have this flexibility in its financing that allows it to give that agency you spoke about to countries. You can't do that when you are too projectized, when you are running after the money rather than making the money work for countries. So core funding for agencies, multilateral agencies, to help build that sort of local capacity that's needed, it's vital. And that's where countries like Norway come in. If we deplete core funding, for instance, for an agency like UNDP, what it means is that we start to engage in mild development. We start, our development character or sort of features will be flawed because we're doing, based on the money that we're given for a specific area, right? So you don't have the strategic view. You are not necessarily accompanying the national aspirations. You are accompanying interest of particular contributors.
And so what happens in the end is that, and I've seen this in a very heavy aid-dependent country like Malawi, you have lots of people, everybody there, and as a policymaker, you're trying to satisfy everyone. Yeah. And obviously you want budget support, but because of certain big corruption scandals, that has been withdrawn, and donors are going back into projects, and this is creating lots of challenges. We'll soon be able to take some questions from you. If you're interested, Osman, let me know if there are questions from YouTube and our online audience. But I want to, and please just raise your hands, I'll try and look more in your direction now. But I wanted to pursue this idea of aid being either politicized, which it is, right? And I was speaking with our friend, the head of NORAD, Bod Vegard, on my podcast. If you haven't heard In Pursuit of Development, this is the advert for my podcast. And he talks about, as the head of NORAD, the enlightened self-interest. This is the kind of new thing, right? So, because aid is never going to be without conditions. It's always about our values, the certain things we cherish. That's our taxpayers will otherwise, bark at us. But we can somehow couch it in a different manner and tone down certain unintended consequences. Is that a way to think about, because Ona, you mentioned, like, in terms of the financing gap, aid is just one part of the equation. There's the private sector financing that is required, but also taxation, national revenue generation, which a lot of African countries are struggling with. There's a huge informal sector, all of that. What are your thoughts there, Morten, in terms of financing development going forward, SDGs, and the role of aid?
There is only one way to finance this, and that is through domestic resource mobilization, really. I think we are moving away from the whole world of aid. It will remain with us. Aid in these kind of country to country, I give you support, daddy for these kind of things, either budget support or these kind of earmarking. It's getting, if you look at the larger picture of global financing in developing countries, it is shrinking, and it's shrinking rapidly. And I think by and large that is a good thing. And even for the poorest and most fragile states, we need to find a way of cutting discord. The aid can be necessary, but it should also be. It wasn't never meant to be forever. If aid becomes something that, for different reasons, prevents countries from starting their domestic resource mobilization, either because the elite is not interested in it, because they can live from the rent of a combination of aid and some rents from natural resources, or for other reasons, what it means is that, let's return to a country where I work a lot, Mali. Mali is hooked on an artificial international life support system right now. And yes, if you unhook it now, Mali is going to collapse. But the idea must be that we must find a way of starting the process so that we can unhook it from this artificial life support system. And as long as we live in a world of states, of nation states, the only way is through domestic resource mobilization. That means building effective, but also eventually legitimate systems of taxation.
Okay, thank you. I see we have two questions from the audience. First, the gentleman in pink.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Ole Otterstad. I come from Union of Education Norway, Norway's second largest union overall. First of all, thank you so much for your contributions and the knowledge I gained today. My question is I find it more and more interesting that scholars of your league, when talking about development, you usually don't talk about unions. And the reason for my question is UN's oldest institution is the ILO. It's actually from before the UN. It's from 1919. And also discussing, and the core issue of ILO with its 187 member countries is social dialogue, as defined by the ILO, not the perception that it's a dialogue with social people. It's the three defined actors. And ILO also says it's essential to have social dialogue, to have financial development and social justice, the two pillars. And when discussing development, it rarely comes up.
So the question is why?
The question is, why do you think this and how can you do it? And coming from Norway, having this discussion in Norway, the Nordic model based on this, we all agree comes from, our prosperity comes from this. So
Thank you. Could we just
take
another question before we ask the panel to respond. Yes, madam. Yeah, the microphone is on its way.
It's been a really interesting discussion how we've traversed from these super high-level political stuff down to the really anecdotal. Someone in Tanzania is saying, man, I really don't want to research this, but I have to if I want to get money. And basically, it's like we're having this discussion on aid, which is when you're working in the African context and living there and you've got skin in the game, we're talking about how do we do life. And I'm interested, as someone who's worked in the private sector in Burundi for several years, where it's difficult to get funding for private sector enterprises, where we're outside of these, just to get a $10,000 working capital loan is difficult. And that makes a difference. So my question to the panel is, who are the players that do this sort of stuff? The 2 to 10 to 15 to even that is beyond $15,000 is too much. Just that that bridge can change things. And it's not these high level discussions. And why, I guess, the trust thing, Morten, which you brought up, is really important. Why don't more, you have so much money, why don't you back regional banks and say, if this goes down, we'll take the fall? Because you're giving the money anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 2 questions, but any general issues that you would like to reflect on in a final round, like 2 minutes each? We have like 8 minutes. With you first, Ragnhild.
I thought these were 2 really fantastic questions from the audience. I think I'm so much in agreement with you that we need to talk much more about trade unions. I think it's of critical importance. And I think it's a little bit related to what you were saying too. It's about this idea that we have, that people need to come together as collectives to demand certain things, and that's maybe the problem of some of the logic of aid, is that you're not necessarily building that. If you're giving projects to different things that are going to go for a certain time, and then you're expecting it to sort of run by itself afterwards, but the structures of power underneath this, the access to credit, those things, the rights that people have, and holding businesses to account and holding governments to account and so on, that is sort of the fundamental power where that's sustained over time. And being a scholar in the US, obviously this is also something that I see there, where the very deliberate undermining of trade unions and what that's done to a society like the US, and the inequality that comes from that, and the failure to like make sure that people have a salary that they can actually construct a decent life out of. So I think we need to definitely talk much more about that. We need to talk much more about trade unions, organizations, and we need to talk much more about access to credit. Not micro all the time, bigger credits, getting the having access, especially women, young entrepreneurs, getting access to starting a business is really important, because you're expecting like women in the countryside of Africa to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. It's not possible. Or maybe it is. I mean, I'm a political scientist, I'm not an economist, but the constant thinking about the crumbs and the micro, and not thinking about the power structures underneath these long-term development processes, I think is blindsiding us.
Thanks, Ragnhild. Morten, 1.5 minutes.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think I wanted to end my part of this by saying that we don't need a new narrative on Africa. We need new perspectives on Africa. And the reason why we don't need a new narrative for Africa is simply that it's impossible to have one, in my point of view. The continent is simply too diverse. There is so many different Africas that sort of it becomes an impossibility of having something that should unite the enormous diversity of this continent. And that is something these new perspectives needs to take that into considerations. And then I'm certain that various parts of Africa, various African countries, various regional parts of Africa may develop their and market their own new narratives about themselves, but these needs to be homegrown and come from within and should not be imposed from outside. In the meantime, I think in the last 30 seconds that I have, I mean, I would like to return to this issue of partnerships, because, I mean, this is how we should work together. And I mean, genuine partnerships about the production of knowledge, I think, is immensely important. And we have models for that. I mean, there are ways that we are doing this. And I see that in my work with my colleagues in the Sahel. I mean, we are getting much closer now to sort of having this, where we work on the project from its very sort of inception phase, where we design and develop the project proposal together, to the way of getting it funded, and then we sort of do this, we do data collection together, and we co-author together. I mean, this is as close. Will we be completely equal in all these phases of this project? No, we will never be. Not in my lifetime. But that is something that we can live. We can acknowledge that, because it's about what it's all about in these kind of partnerships. It's not striving for an equality that is impossible. It's about making inequality work for mutual benefit, in my point of view.
Thank you, Morten. Hamdi, a minute now.
Yes. When it comes to your question, I would suggest you to look at Norfund. They give funding to different organizations and companies in the global south. So I would suggest you to look up on that. I don't really have much to add to this, other than what has already been said. But I think a way in changing the narrative or changing the perspective is to give the platform to African scholars and researchers to be able to bring their findings and the research that they have done within an African context, because I truly believe that is the way in which knowledge production can be more representative, and the policy making also more representative, so that it benefits people on the ground.
Thank you. You get the last word, Ahuna.
Yeah. I agree with Morten on the need to change perspectives of Africa as not one country where everything is the same and you apply a template, but as a diverse, very different landscape with different needs and different. And I think that also on Hamdi's point of how you change this perspective, it's really globalizing the voice of Africa, because we in UNDP created what we call African Influences for Development, out of frustration that when you talk about development on the continent, the view is that it's development that's coming from outside, and that Africans are helpless and hopeless, and you just go and do things for them. And yet, as an agency that works on the continent, we know it is the contrary is the case. We've got people on the continent investing in development, investing their own minds and their own assets and resources. And we didn't have to look very far. And we put a group of these people together and say, we want to work with them on a platform that starts to showcase because first you need to generate respect for the people of Africa. And it is lacking when your head is filled with an aid mentality. If it's all coming from, these are the people we have to raise money for and stuff, you don't have that respect. And when respect is missing, you don't have partnership, and definitely not an equal one. So part of changing that sort of mindset, whatever we call it, is first understanding that there are Africans who have the answers and who are applying themselves and actually investing, whether they're researchers or business people, or the creatives, African creatives are just making waves around Africa and the world. You need to know, the people in Norway need to know that Africans have values also. Europe isn't the only one with values, and Africa is starting to embrace its own values, and the world needs to know that Africa has something to offer to it. Today, in the crisis that the world just experienced, multilateralism was alive and well in Africa. It wasn't in the rest of the world. Africa would not have been able to overcome COVID-19 had it not applied multilateralism in terms of how it approached the crisis. So Africa has a lot of value. Even if the world has not started to see it, it should see it. And on your point, I think this has been our frustration. If you're looking for $100,000, $200,000, it's easier to raise it than to raise 10. And so what UNDP has done in response to this is created what we call Timbuktu, which is this initiative that will help us create a parent fund of $1 billion, because again, I agree with you totally that we shouldn't just be doing micro. When we think of Africa, we go micro. That micro is important, but we need to understand that sometimes to power these startups, they need that bridging, They just need that little push to be able to get up, and sometimes that's within the range of $5,000 to $20,000. And so our fund will be looking at this category. We're creating hubs in 8 African countries that will focus on each development problem area and mine. It's a Pan-African fund, actually, and it will mine the talents of all these people in one area. So Rwanda could be the health tech, and everybody on the continent who is starting initiatives in health will get support from that hub. So it's not yet there, but it's coming. But there are others who already can begin to disburse these kinds of funds.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank the panel, the Assistant Secretary General for coming all the way to Norway, and to you, and all the hundreds of thousands of people that are watching us on YouTube today, hopefully. I'm sure a recording will be made available. Thank you, Henrik, Harald, the team at UNDP Norway, Maya, Oda1, and my colleague Oda2, all of you, and not least Nupi for hosting us today, Osman and your team. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are. Thank you.